Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you all, and welcome to all those people joining us online on Zoom. As I mentioned earlier, this is our first hybrid meeting. People are turning up online, and we're very fortunate to have local celebrity and local historian Mike Guilfoyle to talk to us about Robert Fabian of the Yard. And hand over to you, Mike. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, and thank you, members of the Ladywell Society in person and online, to give me this opportunity. It's a curtain raiser for the beginning of the year. The talk, and thank you for the generous introduction, Robert. When I heard the description of me as a famous local author, I spoke to my agent and I said, let's negotiate an increased fee. But no, that's not what happened. I'm a member of the Ladywell Society. I'm also the chair of the Friends of Brockton Ladywell Cemetery. And I thought today the talk that I'm going to give would be structured in three simple ways. A brief introduction, biographical information about Robert Fabian, something about the celebrated cases he was actually involved in investigating, and then a brief coda on his legacy. So hopefully that will be the best part of 2 hours. No, 20 minutes. 20 minutes, apologies, Robert. Duly alarmed. So I've sourced the information about Robert Fabian, Inspector Fabian of Scotland Yard, from a couple of books that are still in publication that date from the 1950s. The first one is Fabian of the Yard. As you can see, it's well dog-eared, and it basically is a distillation of his 28 years as an investigative detective in the Metropolitan Police. The second book is London After Dark. It's really an account of his time in the Vice Squad. It's got a very Hogarthian underbelly of 1920s, 1930s London, particularly in Soho. So those are the two books that I've added a reference. I'll mention a couple more as we go along. So what do we know about Robert Fabian, the man, before he became a celebrated detective? Well, we know that he was born in Ladywell in January 1901, and he was born at 25A Mallions Road, which is not too far from here. And what we don't know is why his middle name was Honey. Interestingly enough, why his parents decided to call him Robert Honey Fabian. That's not a name that comes up regularly in his investigative history. He was born to Andrew Pinmore Fabian and Ada Taggart. And the biographical information about his early years is slightly sketchy. There's some information in the main book, his magnum opus, Fabian of the Yard. But we know that he went to an elementary school in Catford, and he said in the book it was an uneventful period as a school pupil. I'm rather surmising it might well be Holbeach, that's the closest to Mallions Road, but that's speculative. He followed in his father's footsteps. Age 12, he went to study at the Borough Polytechnic, which opened in 1892, which is now London Southbank University, and he went to train as an engineering draftsman. So far, so good, but sometime between his arrival and his period as a draftsman, not significant periods of draftsman, his family introduced him to a police inspector called Rolfe. That seems to have made quite an abiding impression on him, and his direction of travel in terms of his career suggested he wanted to go into the Metropolitan Police. And in fact, his ambition to become a detective is described in the book as Sherlock Holmes was to me what Dick Barton is to the boys of today. Dick Barton, Special Agent, was a 1950s creation, and the book's obviously written in the 1950s, so just bear that in mind. In 1921, that significant career move resulted in him applying to become a police constable, and he applied at Ladywell Police Station, which is here. It was previously called Lewisham Police Station, opened in 1899. The architect of this police station, and most of the police stations in the London area, was a man called John Butler Dixon, who studied under Norman Shaw. His tutelage, Norman Shaw, very famous architect, responsible for the old Scotland Yard. And it's, so that's where the application was made. Interestingly enough, this is a Ladywell police station. The boxer Errol Christie, in his interesting biography called No Place to Hide, he calls hot reception at Ladywell police station following one of his arrests, but we won't go down that particular line of investigation. Once he'd been accepted in the Metropolitan Police, he went to a station house in the West End and was assigned a particular police station on Vine Street. Vine Street. And this is a very atmospheric and evocative image of Vine Street. You can see the constable looking rather imperiously at the photographer. It's about 1940, I think, this particular image. And Police Constable Robert Fabian reported to duty at Vine Street, which was in the C division of the Metropolitan Police area, and he covered, amongst other London districts, Mayfair and Soho. Soho in the 20s, the roaring 20s, the jazz age, was a hotbed of entertainment and also a hotbed for crime, vice, and, should we say, misdemeanour. And with that in mind, Inspector Fabian, Police Constable Fabian, should I say, began his policing career. Interestingly enough, there's a biography called This Small Cloud by a man called Sergeant Harry Daly, who was the first openly gay police officer in the Metropolitan Police, who also served at Vine Street at the same time. I've not been able to establish whether the two are any contact, professional contact, but it's an interesting juxtaposition. And the accounts that Fabian gives, particularly in London After Dark, give a rather colourful flavour of some of his early encounters as a police constable on the beat. Fabian rose in rank over the years. He became head of the Vice Squad, the Murder Squad, the Flying Squad, the Criminal Records Office. So he immersed himself in the law, culture and practice of the Metropolitan Police, and it was obvious and evident from his biography that his particular ability, skills and attitude were going to be much in demand. I mean, I wouldn't describe him as a paragon of progressive penology, that some of his views on crime and punishment are more traditional and hardline, but unsurprisingly, given an officer rising in the ranks in the 1920s, that's probably not an exceptional perspective. But he was always impeccably attired. He remained unflappable, with a steely resolve. He was a man of courage, integrity, and uncompromising rectitude, and that comes through loud and clear from his writings. Some of his accounts might sound a bit self-aggrandizing, but his police career of 28 years, from 1921 to 1949, resulted in no less than 40 commendations. In 1939, he was given the policing equivalent to the Victoria Cross, or awarded the policing equivalent to the Victoria Cross from the then King. It was the King's Police Medal, and that was for dismantling an IRA bomb in Piccadilly, which is recounted in the book. Rather than the understated courage, presence of mind, and application to take a live bomb, which was actually not detonated, back to Vine Street Police Station. Who knows what people thought when he was coming into Vine Street Police Station with a live bomb, but he successfully defused that. Now, he was involved in hundreds of investigations, and I want to briefly allude to three, which I think are illustrative and emblematic of his career as a police officer. The first one, I think we've got a slide for this, Mike, the next slide, is a robbery that occurred in December 1937 at the Hyde Park Hotel in Knightsbridge. Hyde Park, it's just behind the hotel. And what was significant about this particular robbery was that the perpetrators, the four perpetrators, were all drawn, surprisingly, from middle-class, affluent and comfortable backgrounds, not the traditional image of working class blackguards out to make a quick buck. And that, in a sense, is what's the most significant aspects of this particular crime, because what happened, in brief, was a Cartier representative called Etienne Bellinger was lured to the hotel, ostensibly to meet a wealthy foreign buyer with jewellery that was estimated variously between 16 and 30,000 pounds. When he arrived, he was actually attacked, bludgeoned, and narrowly avoided fatal injuries. How he survived, he was beaten quite brutally many times over the head, but he did survive, and he was able to give evidence of where he recovered. The perpetrators were apprehended shortly thereafter. Fabian was one of the investigating officers, and he used his extensive contacts in the underworld, particularly informers, and particularly offences, those who received stolen goods, who gave him a heads up as to who may be responsible, not completely altruistically, because there was a significant reward for the offence in question. Anyway, the four perpetrators, as I say, were caught. They were dubbed the Mayfair Playboys. And if you're interested in the case, because it is a very interesting case on a number of levels, then the book by Angus McLaren called Playboys and Mayfair Men, Crime, Class, Masculinity and Fascism in 1930s London. It's a bit like reading for you. Then that book is certainly worth reading, and that's one reference, I think, on the case. As I say, they were quickly apprehended. They were tried at the Central Criminal Court, and they were convicted. Each was sentenced to terms of penal servitude, as it was called in the day. But significantly, the trial judge was suitably outraged by the ferocity of the assault and the social class of the perpetrators. Significantly, 2 were sentenced to be flogged. Flogging, a corporal punishment in British prison system, existed until 1948 when it was abolished. And that, in a sense, involved quite a lively and animated discussion debate in the media and beyond about the suitability of flogging criminals that have been sentenced. But we'll put that to one side. So that was the Mayfair Playboy gangster who uses his cat sentence. I think that's one of the, that's Jenkins actually, who apparently they both took their flogging with manly resolve, if I can put it like that. But the next case is an interesting one. 2 reasons. The case involved an event which was outside the Metropolitan Police jurisdiction. And one of the spin-offs of Robert Fabian's fame and recognition for his investigative skills as a detective, the inspector, the Metropolitan Police detective inspector, chief inspector, it says here, was that he was enlisted to try to resolve a quite grisly murder that occurred on the 14th of February 1945, St Valentine's Day, in a place called Lower Quinton, which is in Warwickshire, not far from Stratford-upon-Avon. There is an image of Charles Walton. This is Charles. He was coming back from hedging the day, he was a farm labourer aged 74, when he was accosted by an unknown assailant, and he was brutally murdered with a pitchfork. And the pitchfork went straight through his face and through his neck. And there is an image which I decided that members of the Ladywell Society were probably too sensitive to see, but you can see it online if you're interested. It's in the public domain. And the manner of his death, a cross was etched on his chest, suggestive of a witchcraft, some ritualistic sort of murder, which had a resonance with the rural England at that particular time, in that particular part of England. There had been some examples of witchcraft, which the two were sort of conflated. Anyway, Inspector Fabian was called to, enlisted to try to solve the crime. It was an extensive police investigation, including interviewing prisoners of war in a local prison camp nearby, Italian prisoners of war. But despite of all these greatest best endeavours, the crime remained unsolved because he encountered what he described as a wall of silence. And the murder remains unsolved to this day. In fact, it's one of the few murders that Inspector Fabian investigated that would remain unresolved. If you're interested in the case, just more about the case, Simon Reed's 2014 book, The Case That Foiled Fabian, Murder, Witchcraft, and in Rural England, comes highly recommended. The final case I mentioned, 1947, post-war England, in the grip of a sort of media moral frenzy about the lawlessness of youth and crime running out of control. And the particular offence in question suggests that this was, next slide, Mike, was in a sense emblematic of this. It was the most famous photograph of the 1940s, famous crime photograph of the 1940s. It shows, sadly, the aftermath of a failed robbery at Sherlock Street and Tottenham Court Road, when 3 armed robbers were foiled in an attempt to rob a jeweller's called Jay's, and they shot the man who was lying prostrate here in the head. He died shortly afterwards. He was called Alec Antiqui. He was an Anglo-Italian motor mechanic, father of 6. And the resolve of the Metropolitan Police to find the perpetrators was unmatched in terms of resources, energy, and application. The 3 robbers were actually caught shortly thereafter, again through Fabian's keen investigative skills, and they were tried at the Old Bailey, and 2 of them, Christopher Geraghty and Charles Jenkins, were actually hanged at Pentonville Prison in September 1947. The third, Thomas Rolt, 17, was actually detained in His Majesty's pleasure and was released in 1957 after serving 10 years. Intriguingly, this particular crime episode, sad as it was the inspiration for the film The Blue Lamp, 1950 film The Blue Lamp. So we have 3 brief crime scenes, scenarios, all of which involve Inspector Fabian. In the book, the Fabian of the Yard, there's over 35 different cases, so obviously in terms of time I'm constrained by that. But one of the cinematic legacies I've mentioned, The Blue Lamp, was in Robert Fabian retired from the police force in 1949, after 28 years in the force. The next slide, Mike. 1954-56, the actor Bruce Seaton played the eponymous Inspector Fabian in a series called Fabian of the Yard, based on the detective Fabian's career, and in fact, you can still see this actually on YouTube. Fabian comes in at the epilogue to give, we are fictionalised, but he comes in to give his contribution. The series also screened in America, and it's called Patrol Car in America. But so he has some posthumous cinematic fame, and like I said, the series was very much its time, but it's well worth if you get the chance to look at it. So Fabian, Robert Fabian, Inspector Fabian, the Governor, as he was referred to by Dick Kirby in one of his books on the Metropolitan Police, that appellation given to inspectors and beyond who gained a particular affection and profile from the rank and file. He died in 1978, aged 77, at Epsom Hospital in Surrey. So past one of Scotland Yard's finest detectives and legendary policing, he found himself in the policing pantheon, as you can discover from brief comments I've made. Now, does he warrant the designation Ladywell's Sherlock Holmes? Well, his literary detective alter ego, absent the magnifying glass, well, it's for others to decide. But the New York Times, in its eulogy, quotes this what I think is a quintessentially Holmesian epitaph. I soon noticed that the best way to beat the crook would be to study his methods and follow the reasoning of his warped mind. Like I say, it's interesting that the final shot that we have today is Fabian with Sherlock Holmes. And it was taken in 1953 outside the Criterion Theatre in London with the famous Sherlockian actor, a man called Carlton Hobbs, unveiling a plaque at the Criterion, which recorded the first Sherlock Holmes novel, Studied in Scarlet, which was written in 1887. At the end of the Fabian of the Yard, the epilogue, Fabian fades out gracefully, and that's what I'll do now, and thank you for listening.
It's quite amazing. There's a little counter on my video camera there. You're 20 minutes right on the dot. So that's
the first.
Just any brief questions?
Oh, yes,
that
yes,
we might. We've only got a couple of minutes, but anybody got any questions? Anyone online? Can we hear people online?
It's going to be difficult online.
Right.
Mike, how many years have you served?
28. 1921 to 1949.
Do we know like whether we ever did any investigations in Lewisham and Ladywell area?
Not that I'm aware of, Sean.
Just that he was born, is it Marion's Road he was born?
25A, Marion's Road, yes. All the investigations, he was based principally in central London, obviously Vine Street, which is now closed, it reopened, closed, West End Central, the police station. So all his investigations were the Vice Squad, the Murder Squad. The one link locally that I've been able to establish was the Roxham Hill murder in 1946, I think. The woman was strangled on Box Hill from the south down to north down to it was a lorry driver from Essex, I believe, Cambridgeshire, who was actually, it was a wonderful piece of detective investigation and forensics follow-up from Fabian and the detectives. And the woman who was the murder victim, her brother's buried in Ladywell Cemetery. But I think all his investigations were outside of this area. The C division wasn't part of Lewisham. He did actually mention in one of his books, I'll just briefly finish this, that in terms of local policing in Lewisham, that the local police officers had a particular way of dealing with unruly youth, and they used to put marbles in their gloved hands and whack them rather unceremoniously. Anyway.
To prove that people are actually listening and can hear, just about. You have a question?
Oh. David, does the house in Marion's Road have a plaque? Well, no, it doesn't, as far as I can.
No, it doesn't.
No. It's an interesting question. I mean,
Yes, your man used to live there.
that was one of the things actually might be worth considering. Again, it's two things quickly. Having it'd be instrumental in getting the plaque for David Jones in Arabin Road. It's been great work for it. A maroon plaque rather than the blue plaque. Blue plaque, obviously, for people who normally have been dead for about 100 years or so. But a maroon plaque is something that Lewisham has for those who've previously been given service or have a particular claim to posterity and their achievements. I mean, it probably would be better for people who are in the Metropolitan Police or who might have an interest to follow that one up. So, no is the answer, but there are avenues of possibility, and that's one possible avenue that people might want to consider.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.